Um, where and when were you born? Do you consider yourself a Scotsman?
Yes, I was born in 1952 in St Andrews, and so that's the home of golf in Scotland. And I do consider myself a Scotsman, although technically I'm only half Scots. I'm also quarter English and quarter Danish. I
Ah.
have an English grandmother, and the other grandmother was Danish.
What month? I'm asking that because I'm interested in people's astrological sign.
Oh, May. I'm just on the cusp of Taurus and Gemini.
Mm-hmm. And do you identify with one more the other? You seem more like a Gemini.
Um, Possibly, yes. I think I'm probably a mixture, which is appropriate. I've got Gemini rising, even though I'm just still in Taurus.
What day in May?
20th.
Ah, so kind of depends on the year. Um, and then, do you living in France, growing up in England and Scotland, do you find that, for example, if you're teaching or presenting, that you would slant it differently because you're speaking to French people or to English people or whatever, or Americans?
That would depend on the context. I mean, I used to teach French,
Right.
and so I'm very happy living in France. I feel quite at home. And also particularly in this area, which is the area associated with the Albigensian Crusade and the Cathars.
I always have this picture that Americans rush and eat in the car and go through fast food places, while the French would take 2 hours for a beautiful picnic lunch in the countryside and relish their food and their wine and their friends and family. Is that still true, that there's more enjoyment of life, taking time to savor it?
I would say so. Yes, because the most places still closed for lunch. Not the main supermarkets, but for instance, the chain called Bricomarché, where you get all your tools and that kind of thing, garden supplies. They close for lunch. So it's the rule rather than the exception that French close for lunch.
Is it 2 hours or one?
Well, sometimes more, because the little village shop we have here, it opens at 8:30, and then it closes at 12:30, opens again at 4:30, and then goes until 7.
Ah.
So it's a slightly different structure of the day.
And then do people eat their main meal of the day at midday?
I think so. I mean, we tend to have a slightly lighter meal. I mean, we don't eat that much in the evening either, but sort of lighter, more salad type meal in the middle of the day.
Mm-hmm. Because there was a kind of well-known book about how the French eat these wonderful sauces and butter and have less cholesterol and better health outcomes. And it seems to me part of it is not rushing.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, I always find when I come back here from London, I immediately go into a slower mode. And we walk our dog every morning. We swim in the river. We swim in the lake in the summer, and we have a sort of slow routine. I'm a great fan of slow food, all of these sort of movements, which have been, I think, pioneered by the Italians.
Yes.
So that's I think taking it slower, often you do a better job.
Right, and you enjoy life more because you have stress hormones, cortisol reactions when I have to hurry.
No, very true.
Yeah.
So I think France in general, I mean, Paris would be, the big cities, they're just as stressed, but I think rural France, there has a good pace of life still, and there's little markets and people pass the time of day with each other and so on.
And they're probably not as irritated or grouchy with each other, I would imagine.
No, I don't think so. No. Again, that's exactly a function of the amount of stress that people are under.
Yeah.
You do see people who are in a hurry, and the French tend to be breaking the speed limit most of the time. It's just come down from 90 to 80. And you probably heard that there's a big protest movement. They're called the Les Gilets Jaunes.
Oh, je sais, I know. They've been going for 14 weeks.
They have.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that later. Do you know your Myers-Briggs or your Enneagram, or those personality types?
Yes, I tried the Myers-Briggs, for this, and I'm. Let me just check. I'm ENFJ.
That's what I am. I'm doing it because my thesis is that most people will be Ns, will be intuitives, and so far I only have one S. Everybody else is intuitive.
All right. So N is intuitive, is it?
Yeah. The way it goes is these
got
are
a high score on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's extroverted, introverted, intuitive, sensing, feeling, thinking, J or P, and those words are judging and perceiving, but they're not accurate. So J's like you and me like to check things off their list, and if you're really J, you will put something on your list you've done so you can check it off.
Right. Okay.
Have you done that?
Obviously, when one's doing a binary test like that, sometimes you find yourself in the middle.
Yes.
And you choose one, even though you're not choosing it very strongly.
Yes, and they allow for an X, so you could be like half extroverted, half introverted.
Okay, right, yeah.
So the test allows for that. Well, you have a very interesting mother in terms of looking at childhood influences on your thinking, who had all kinds of precognitive dreams and clairvoyant insights. Tell us a little bit about her.
Well, she was she never sort of, it was all things that happened to her just in life, rather than being involved in any professional sense. She just had this intuitive psychic sense where she would know things sometimes precognitively. She had some out-of-body experiences. She had a near-death experience, and she would have a prompter who, if she asked a question, then she would get the answer often to the question, often very practical. Lost my keys, where are they? And that
she would hear kind of a voice in her head. Is that how she got the information?
Yes, a sort of prompt like that, exactly.
Mm.
So obviously that opened me up to the reality of this, because in some cases, or in a number of cases, there was a veridical element to the perception. Now, I'll give you one interesting example, which is my father was very late coming back from a lunch or something, and obviously before the days of mobile phones, you couldn't phone up and say you were coming and keep in touch like that. And so we tried, just as an experiment, with a map dowsing, to see whether she could pick up his car rather, and so we sort of picked him up on the map about 2 miles away, and then we got to the point where if this was correct, he should be turning into the drive in about 20 seconds. So I went out. The drive is 300 yards long, and so I went out, and as I went out, I saw his car turning into the drive.
Lovely. So, when she had her NDE, did she have the review of her life and being greeted by?
No, she didn't. No, it was really a. Yes, I think I don't remember much detail, to be honest. No, but she certainly didn't talk about that.
And then she had a dream about a job that she would get, and that was the job. She saw that scene when she pulled in for the interview.
Yes, that's right. That was in the mid-70s.
Mm-hmm. And you said your father was a skeptic. What was his reaction to her insights?
Oh, non-committal. I mean, I don't think he ever commented really, but he wasn't that type.
Okay. And then what were they? They were Church of England, or what was? Did you go to church when you were a boy?
Yes, we were Episcopalian Church, which is effectively the Church of England in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
And but we went pretty irregularly. My mother had periods when she went quite often. We'd always go for Christmas and Easter. And then when I was living there a few years ago, I'd probably go once a month. And I was also on the vestry committee at one point. But that was more because I wanted to do something useful locally, to make a contribution locally rather than from any particular strong involvement with the church.
At one point, you considered being a priest, an Anglican priest, but you were really more drawn to Swedenborg, that kind of.
That's right. Yes. No. I thought about this, and then I went to spend a weekend at a theological college in Oxford, and that pretty much put me off.
There's a lot of controversy in theology about who said what when, and did Paul really say this, and it becomes argumentative in a way. Do you think that's accurate?
Very much, and also we know from biblical criticism that the Gospels have been altered, redacted, edited. Things have been put in, other things have been taken out, according to the theology of the translator and interpreter.
Right.
So, the Gospels could be the sort of, the Word of God in the sense that evangelicals insist. Really, from a scholarly point of view, is untenable.
Right, unless God changes her mind a lot.
Well, I remember Raymond Moody telling me that one of his patients had a near-death experience, and it was an evangelical patient, and when he or she came back, she said, "I learned that God is interested in theology.
Mm.
God is interested in what's in your heart."
Mm. Yes, that's so true. I think of all the Christian fundamentalists who say they care about abortion, but then they don't care about the baby when it's born. They don't do any kind of support programs in the U.S. for those children. It's just a way to control women. So what about Swedenborg interested you? He died in 1772, so he was...
That's right. Well, when I was at St Andrews, I read French literature, and among the people I read was Baudelaire, who was a 19th century French poet, and one of his poems is called Correspondences. And so I was looking in the notes because I was studying the poem, and it then mentioned that Swedenborg had influenced Baudelaire. So I thought, well, that's very interesting. So I went to the library and I got out a biography of him. And one evening I stayed in and started reading it, and I was absolutely riveted. And I thought, here is a man who's both a mystic and a scientist, and someone with very clear mathematical and engineering and scientific mind, who writes as if he's giving a case report about what he perceived in the other dimensions in the spiritual world. And I was very struck by that because it's all very matter of fact. And so I realized that the sort of experiences my mother had were also being written about by Swedenborg with considerable intellectual authority.
Mm-hmm. And did he advocate a spiritual discipline or a way to find spiritual understanding? I mean, meditation or some kind of spiritual practice?
Well, not that I can think of. But then he led a very productive and kind of life. He was known to be a very kind person and considerate, and he managed to operate in a number of different worlds. And so, while he was writing these books, he was still sitting in the upper house of the Swedish Parliament, and managing engineering affairs, at least for part of that time. Obviously, he would have retired from that work at a certain point.
Mm. And in a way, Jung, your interest in Carl Jung is the same, someone who's very intellectual and very visionary.
Yes, the first thing I read by Jung was in the 70s, and when I took I left the bank and I took 4 boxes of books, on to the continent, and I spent a year, during which time I read all those books. And Modern Man in Search of a Soul was one of those. And then at a slightly later stage, my friend and mentor Norman Coburn, he left me Jung's collected works. So I have those.
Mm-hmm. I was really moved by Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. That's a fascinating book.
Absolutely. And that was one of his last books. And obviously the most personal book. And there's huge insight, to be gained from that book.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think he kind of encapsulates why we're here, that he says to become individuated, to become whole, to become conscious of the unconscious. That's really a guideline for how to live, how to progress.
Yes, I agree.
Do you write down your dreams, or have had periods where you do dream analysis?
Not that systematically, to be honest. It comes up from time to time, and we had fairly recently, there was something I was doing where we were asked to try and remember our dreams, and so there's no doubt that if you work with your dreams, then your dreams will work with you.
That's so true, and it's the best way to access the unconscious. I mean, it's so direct.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
You also were interested in someone that I've never heard of, a Bulgarian teacher for whom you learned Bulgarian, named Peter Deunov?
Yes, that's right.
How do you pronounce his name?
Deunov. He has a spiritual name which is Beensa Douno, Douno, and then his family name is Peter Deunov. So that yes, I came across him in 1985 because I bought a book by somebody who was his disciple and sent to teach in France called Omram Mikhail Ivanov, and I read a book on cosmic moral laws. And then I ordered really everything that Ivanov had written. And as I started reading it, I came across Peter Deunov, and I realized that the most valuable source of this teaching came from him. So I then found out as much as I could. I bought quite a lot. There was very little available in English at that time. And so I bought quite a lot in French and read it in French. And then I came across an old Bulgarian called Anna Bertoli in Paris, and she'd been publishing a periodical for 30 years. So I ordered all of those. That's about a foot worth of material, and I read all that as well.
And then that was in French or Bulgarian? Excuse me.
I read it in French.
Yeah.
And then I met a Bulgarian in the local village where I lived, and I took lessons with her for 18 months, twice a week. To learn the language. And then I went there first in 1989, which was just before the fall of communism and the wall. And so it was quite a different place to what it is now. We're looking very ramshackle, run down, very old cars. The airport was primitive. And people were living in fear. It was a police state. And my friend had to report to the police every 2 days, to confirm that we were still up in the mountains.
And what was his message?
The message of Deunov?
Yes.
Yes. You can encapsulate it in 5 principles: love, wisdom, truth, justice, and goodness. And those are the 5 principles which correspond symbolically to the pentagram. And they're expressed through his songs, because he was a musician, and also through his movements, which are called Paneurhythmy. So this is a series of symbolic movements where you dance expressions of those principles.
Is it a little bit like Qigong?
No, it's done to music. Some of the exercises resemble Qigong movements insofar as if you're moving your arms and legs, you're likely to move in a way that has some kind of parallels. Although it's a different, I would say that although the movements are kind of divided into movements which emphasize the line representing the masculine and the curve representing the feminine. And so you get what he calls electric or masculine movements and magnetic or feminine movements, which are much softer and smoother. And so a combination of those gives you a very good physical condition. I do something called the 22 exercises. I do those every morning. And so they're part of my practice.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a movement towards androgyny and expressing both ways of being in each person.
Well, balancing the masculine and the feminine, balancing the heart and the head, balancing the feet in relationship to the earth, with the head in relation to the invisible world.
Mm-hmm. I'm asking everyone, when are the most difficult times, the most difficult challenges in your life, and how did you cope? Because I think it's useful to know how smart people deal with these issues and that everybody has them.
Well, I think it's really around this whole spiritual path, where I had my biggest challenges, because I think my parents interpreted my involvement with Deunov as a sect, and so they were concerned that I'd been kind of hypnotized by this, and that I would therefore, if I might give away family money, to the sect or to the group, and that has indeed been the case with many people. But I made it very clear that I wasn't going to do that, but they didn't trust me. And so I was partially disinherited on that basis. But I felt so strongly within myself that what I was doing was right, and that I had to choose the spirit and spiritual commitment over the interests of the family, which is very difficult for the family to understand, because most people put family absolutely first, and they can't conceive of how you could put family second in favor of something else. And but I went through with that, and I feel I'm sad that it had to create this sort of division, but it was a matter of principle, and that not being, responding to that kind of pressure. I understand why they would have felt it was in the best thing to do, because everybody acts in accordance with what they feel the best thing is to do, after their own lights.
I'm surprised that your mother wasn't more understanding, because it's, she could intuitively know that it was something that you would handle well.
Yes, I mean, I think she, they had quite a controlling attitude, and they used to say, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so, if you went out of line, then you could expect to be punished. So this was a form of punishment, as I see it.
Do you have siblings?
Yes, I have. I have one brother who died 18 months ago, and then I have another brother and a sister.
So, and what was your birth order?
I was the eldest.
So you're one of four.
One of four.
I'm asking because there was a book that someone told me about where he said rebel scientists tended to be later born, but I'm not really finding that.
Mm.
Then any other challenges that were particularly?
Well, nothing of that order. No, because I think I've had a very beautiful and wonderful life in so many ways, and so I've been very blessed.
Mm-hmm. Do you have children, may I ask? Because sometimes they can be challenging.
I do. No, I have two. I have two children. I have a daughter of 23 and a son of 20, and they're very different. And I spoke to them, for quite a while last night, which was very nice.
Are they in England?
They're in Scotland.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Yes.
Was it difficult deciding to switch from being a banker to a language and philosophy teacher?
No. No, I felt as soon as I was in, the kind of job I had in banking was regarded as the most desirable thing you could do, by conventional people, because I was in a top merchant bank, and that's exactly the sort of thing my father would like me to have stayed in. But it just wasn't right for me. I asked myself, do I want to be an ex-banker when I'm 70? And I asked myself this when I was 22. And the answer was no. So I carved a different life for myself.
Uh-huh. So you went back to graduate school so that you could teach?
I went back to, I did a what they call a postgraduate certificate of education at Cambridge. And then I taught for 8 years after that.
And what level, were you teaching college or secondary school?
Secondary school. I taught at Winchester College, which is one of the oldest schools in the country. It was founded in 1382.
Wow. And so as a private school, I'm sure your students were really hardworking and bright.
They were. And in fact, Winchester is one of the top academic schools in the country. And so you were, more than half the boys took mathematics at a high level. And so they were very bright.
Does that private government school system still kind of exclude working class students who probably aren't going to go to a public school and then do well on A levels and go to university?
Well, the thing is that something like a third of pupils at Winchester are helped by the school in some way. So there are full scholarships and also a lot of bursaries. And so they're very aware of, trying to open up opportunity for people. And a lot of people, and they are able to, comparatively, are able to take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. Did you, in your adult life, have any of the experiences like your mother with precognition or getting guidance from a seemingly higher source? Has that kind of psi phenomena been part of your development?
Really, no. I haven't had much by way of an exceptional experience.
Okay, then let's talk about you've written a lot of books, which we'll talk about, but first let's talk about your work in organizations. You're the program director for the Scientific and Medical Network. That's supposedly an international group, but I think of it as being British. Tell us about that work.
Yes, well, I've been associated with the network, for nearly 33 years. So that's been a huge part of my life, and a part of that is the editing of the journal, which used to be called Network Review, and it's now called Paradigm Explorer. So the network is based in Britain, but it does have members around the world, and so it is international in that sense. And then we also invite people from abroad to speak at our conferences. And our main conferences are the Mystics and Scientists Conference, which has been going since 1978, and the Beyond the Brain conferences, which have been going since 1995.
So the organization doesn't necessarily sponsor research, but brings people together to share their research.
Yes, I mean the original network was set up because it was and still is very unfashionable and perhaps even dangerous to hold a non-material worldview, and so it was set up with the intent of providing scientists and doctors and engineers and psychologists and philosophers with a safe space where they could talk about what really mattered to them, and while not compromising themselves with their colleagues, and so that's still the case, and it's been one of the very useful functions of the network, that you can have important conversations, significant conversations with open-minded people who will nevertheless give you critical feedback if they feel that what you say can be questioned in some way.
And roughly how many members are there?
At the moment, about 850. There have been over 2,000 in the past, but I think that most membership organizations have shrunk in the last 10 or 15 years with the changing of generations and the advent of the internet, where so much information is available free of charge. And people can network online as well as in person.
What are some examples of topics or themes in Paradigm Explorer, the journal?
Well, we don't actually have themes as such in the journal. I print largely what comes across my desk, which is reviewed. We have a small editorial board, and so things go out for review, and quite a lot is turned down. And so we do have that sort of process. I mean, quite a lot of the last issue was devoted to the Galileo Commission, which we may come to later.
Let's talk about that now. Tell us. I've read a summary of the report. Tell us about what the impetus was to put that report together.
Well, it's very, very consistent with the original aim of the network, which was that science could be pursued on the basis of spiritual, non-material assumptions. In other words, science is not necessarily tied to a scientistic view or a materialistic worldview. We can envisage a science which would have a different basis. So that's exactly the remit of the Galileo Commission report. And what the aim was to formulate a report which would point the way forward to a more expanded science, and also strongly make the point that materialism is in fact a philosophy or presupposition. It's not a scientific finding. And so it's very important to realize that science is actually underpinned by philosophy, or underpinned by presuppositions and assumptions. Every discipline is. But scientists aren't really taught that. And it's not a standard thing for scientists to be exposed to philosophy of science, for instance, where you would learn about this.
I'm thinking, I majored in history at university, and we talked a lot about methodology and understanding that our points of view were biased. So I'm surprised that science doesn't do that.
I think it's just the way that the seminal book in the field, I think, is The Metaphysical Foundations of Modern Science by E.A. Burt, which came out in 1925. It's a long time ago. And as far as I know, until then, nobody had articulated these assumptions that underpin science, and he was mainly ignored for very many years. And then this work was taken up again by Willis Harman at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in the 1990s. And he looked at re-examining these metaphysical foundations of science. And that work is what we've really been continuing, along with the emerging manifesto for a post-materialist science. And so working with the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences and opensciences.org. So I think what we're trying to do is bring together a critical mass of academics and scientists who are prepared to say that the assumption that the brain is entirely responsible for producing consciousness doesn't fit all the data, and we need a wider view. And we also need a wider view because the implications of materialism for human meaning, mental health, and the planet are pretty disastrous.
Yes, absolutely. I was surprised in the report that that it said that the authors agreed that there wasn't good scientific research in terms of replicability. And, I mentioned that to Dean Radin, and he said there's no social science where it's experiment that's absolutely replicable because you're dealing with people. So I just was curious about why the report mentioned that.
Well, it's also within the context. There's a whole section on the crisis of replication. And what Dean also said was that often he would tweak the experiment slightly so that what was being tested was slightly different. So I think that the strength of the data can be seen in meta-analysis more than in strict replication. And that maybe, and I did ask Harold about this, maybe we're dealing with a non-local phenomenon which is not subject to replicability in quite the same way. And then in addition, we're also dealing with the experimenter effect, because we know that people who do identical experiments but who have different outlooks or attitudes are likely to get different results.
That was Marilyn Schlitz is probably the most famous one.
Exactly.
And the skeptic, I've forgotten his name, he did the same thing and didn't get any results.
Richard Wiseman. But the catch-22 is that the skeptics don't recognize the experimenter effect. they because they believe in objectivity, and they're the objective ones, of course, and the people who get the other results are obviously interfering in some way.
Yeah, with their intention.
Which is inconsistent, of course. You can't have it both ways.
Oh, that's interesting. What kind of response have you gotten from the Galileo report?
Well, I've just actually been getting some more endorsements in the last 2 or 3 days. We've had a terrific response from people in the field. Where we've got to is that we're in the process of finalising the full report, which with lots of academic references and detailed, solid argument. And so that will be academically the important thing, because what you've seen is the summary of the argument, and without the detailed argumentation. And so I think the result is very rigorous. And hopefully we can get people to pay some attention to it rather than it just being ignored and dismissed, which is what's happened to a lot of these initiatives.
When I think of compilations of the Psi research, I think of Dean Radin and Claude Swanson have put together just study after study after study after study. Would you add anyone to that list of compilers of Psi research data?
No, I think that's, well, there was a significant article by Etzel Cardenia in the American Psychological Association Journal, in the middle of last year, which was looking at the scientific evidence for Psi. and for him to get it published in that kind of journal is really a step forward.
He's at Lund University.
He is.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
He wouldn't talk to me.
Okay. Right. Good.
So you founded Character Scotland, inspiring purpose, values program where over 300,000 students and probably more now have participated. That's very exciting to me because I'm really interested in youth, and I wondered why you started it and what the basis of it is. What's the nexus of what you're working with kids around?
Well, as a teacher, I've always been interested in the development of young people, and so they could get a sense of purpose and meaning, and then do something worthwhile with their lives. Because professionally, you tend to get sucked into conventional route, and that's what happens to the vast majority of people. And I think if in order to live the most fulfilling life, you really have to find your calling. And so my intent with this program is to give children a self-reflective process, which is education in the true sense of the word, to draw something out from them that they already know intuitively, but the process that we enable them to go through means that they can discover it explicitly. And so a lot of their knowledge is implicit, but they can articulate it explicitly in the work that we do. And that's really the sort of feedback we tend to get, is that people will say, well, I learned a huge amount more about myself. I managed to define my goals and aspirations. I know where I'm going. And this is very valuable, aged between 10 and 15, which is the age group we work with. And particularly 12 to 13, where people are balancing out what I call standing out and fitting in. And we all have that issue throughout our lives. We want to stand out in our individuality, but we also want to fit in with other people.
And what's an example of a question that you ask or an exercise that you give the young people?
Well, the template is really divided into 3 sections. And so we have a template online, which can be downloaded by the children. And so the first part is self-knowledge and self-awareness. So they have to look at some qualities and then decide which of those, out of a choice of 7 in 4 boxes, so they make 4 choices, which of those is the most typical of them, or their strong point, and then what do they need to work on. So we don't say, what's your weak point? We say, what do you need to work on? And the way that they describe that is very honest. Then the second page is to do with inspiration. So they have to find an inspirational figure and write about them, research them, and then work out how that person became inspiring. They weren't always inspiring. How did they become inspiring? And then the third part's about aspiration. And that is what kind of person do you want to become? What do you want to achieve in your life? What's your vision for a better world? And what are you personally going to do about it in the next few weeks?
Great.
So it puts them on the spot.
Great. Are those questions available to other children? Can anyone download them?
Yes, anyone can download the template. I mean, what we call this particular program is Global Citizens in the Making. And that's based on the fact that we need young people with an international outlook. And this can help them move in that direction, because we're going to need an unprecedented degree of collaboration and cooperation as the world moves forward, if we're going to respond to the challenges that we've set ourselves.
So if someone Googled Global Citizens in the Making, would the template come up, or what should they?
You'd have to Google Inspiring Purpose. And then if you go into the website under Pupils, then you'll see that the template's available for download.
Terrific. That's very exciting. Because a lot of people feel that children need values, but they're afraid to talk about it in schools because people will think it's religious indoctrination or something.
That's right, and what we what we major on, not just values but also character. So we're called Character Education Scotland, and more recently the Jubilee Centre, which is in Birmingham University, they've managed to get people to start using the term virtue again, which is very interesting. Mm. And the whole impulse is based on Aristotelian virtue ethics, and which is very fruitful because in a secular context, people are more likely to listen to Aristotle than religions.
In the U.S., I don't know if this is true in the U.K. and France, but adolescents are increasingly anxious and depressed. Especially girls have high rates of anxiety. And it's increasing. It's not decreasing. So I'm wondering if it's an issue in the countries that you know as well.
Well, it certainly is in the UK, and it's worse. The situation is worse for girls. And there also a recent study suggested that those who spend more than 3 hours a day online are more likely to have these problems.
Do you think it's because they compare themselves with others and say, oh, I didn't get enough likes, or people criticize my photograph on Instagram, or I didn't get invited to this group event, or is it that comparative issue?
I think that's true, and I think it also puts pressure on you if you're only allowed to put up, the good things in your life. And so everybody's meant to be having a great time all the time. And life isn't really like that. At least it isn't all the time.
So then it means if I'm not having the great time as all my peers, then there must be something wrong with me.
Well, I wrote a review. I review a lot of books, as you'll have seen from the journal.
Yes.
And I wrote a review of a book on happiness. And I entitled it, I'm Liked, Therefore I Am. There's a paraphrase on Descartes. I think, therefore I am. And so people's sense of self and self-esteem is dependent on the number of likes they get from other people. In other words, they haven't made the transition, and this is obviously a maturity issue, between being outer-directed and inner-directed. And so to the extent you're outer-directed, you depend more on the views, and your happiness depends more on the views of other people. But if you're inner-directed, then that can come more from within.
Yeah, psychology uses the term internal locus of control or external locus. And people with an external locus of control are more anxious because you're dependent.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where I know your work is from Findhorn Gardens, but I'm not clear. I know your name from Findhorn, but I'm not clear what your connection was with the gardens.
Goodness, I'm not sure about that either, because I don't have any direct connection with Findhorn. I have spoken there. I have had friends who've been trustees of Findhorn. I know quite a bit about it because I used to have a mentor called Sir George Trevelyan. He was very involved in that at an early stage, along with Lady Eve Balfour, because they were growing in the early 60s. They were growing these giant vegetables. And Eve Balfour was very interested in that because she had founded the Soil Association in 1946.
What has happened to them recently? I just have this picture of the huge cabbages and talking to the rat Deva and saying, please go someplace else, or mole Deva, go someplace else. All these magical communication with the nature spirits, but are they still functioning like that?
I don't know how much of that's still going on, to be honest. I mean, it's a very mature community because they've been going, since 1962. And so they're coming up for 60 years. And so I don't think giant vegetables are really a focus of their work anymore.
When they started, they were living in, I think you call them caravans and we call them trailers, but I wonder if they are more permanent now.
Oh yes, no, very much. No, there's they've done a lot of building, so things are much more permanent.
Mm-hmm. You were president of the Rankine Trust that has to do with educating adult spirituality. I'm interested in that part of your activity.
That's the Rankine Trust.
Rankine.
And that was founded by Sir George Trevelyan, who I mentioned a moment ago, and it was instrumental in the 70s and 80s. That had a huge number of courses, and so they were put on weekend courses, mainly weekend courses, some longer residential ones, some large conferences like Mystics and Scientists, which was started by them and the Scientific and Medical Network. And then they had a big healing conference, and so it was a tremendous kind of gathering of the clans at that stage. And so there are tens of thousands, about 10,000 people a year would go through their courses when it was at its peak. And I was chairman of trustees for a long time. And then eventually I was president, and then we closed it down 2 years ago.
Why?
Ran out of money. And we actually kept going for far longer than I thought we would. We managed to get various grants to do small projects, but we didn't really have a financial base to go forward. It also felt like mission accomplished.
Oh.
Things don't go on forever. And very good work was done by Rankine, and so I think we can celebrate that rather than regret that it's closed.
What universities do you know that offer programs in consciousness studies or parapsychology, whatever they call it?
Not so many. There's still activity at Edinburgh, which used to have the Koestler Chair. I say used to because the university demoted it. So that, as far as I know, there's no chair at the moment. And there's just a senior lecturer. Because there's really, within the psychology department, they wanted the psychology department to be a 5-star department. And they regarded the association with the Koestler Chair as a handicap. And universities actively went out of their way to avoid getting the chair when it was made available.
Wow.
Because they didn't want to be tainted with parapsychology. So there's that. Northampton has quite a lot of work going on. And also I'm a tutor on MSc that's recently returned to Liverpool John Moores. But that's more on transpersonal psychology. So I don't know that what else is going on, because it's not totally my field. But those are 3 places that are still doing that sort of work.
How interesting. Then you founded the International Futures Forum, and you edit Omnipedia, Thinking for Tomorrow. What's that about?
I was one of the founders. I was not the founder. I was one of the sort of founding fellows, if you like. And the Omnipedia, I did that for a while, but that no longer happens. And so the International Futures Forum is very interesting because its premise is, how do we make good decisions in a world that we cannot completely understand or control? And it's very, very forward-thinking, combining intuitive approaches with rational approaches, experiential learning with analysis, and very creative. So the meetings we had were highly creative and also entertaining. I keep in touch with them, but there's no work of the IFF that I'm currently involved in.
But it's still going on.
It's still going, yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything else organizationally, leadership-wise, that I've left out?
Well, the Swedenborg Society, I was I was president of that for 3 years, and that's you also get a bit involved in the administration. But the main thing is you chair the annual meeting and give an address. And so I did that. That was about 15 years ago, I suppose. And then I was also involved in the International Association for Near-Death Studies in the UK. And I edited the journal of that for a bit in the late 80s and early 90s. I was vice president of that. But that work goes on. But there's a limit to how much one can carry on talking about near-death experiences.
The most interesting new tidbit I learned is I read a book by Dr. Long, who's in Louisiana, and he said that some people have NDEs where it's like they're in hell and it's tormenting. And I always had this picture of NDEs as these blissful, greeted by beings of light and your loved ones. So it was interesting to me that some people don't have that kind of joyful experience.
Yes, it seems a small minority of people have these negative experiences, but then there aren't nearly as many documented as there are the more blissful variety.
Mm-hmm. People don't want to talk about it, probably.
Well, that could be, but also I think it's phenomenological. I don't think that so many of these experiences happen.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, you're right. We've no way of knowing exactly, but and I also think that there are one or two cases where this is my own view. The negative experience is brought on by hanging on to the body instead of surrendering and letting go, because I think at a certain point in the dying process, you have to surrender and let go. And in fact, that's the essence of dying, is surrendering and letting go. And you have to be able to do that. And if you hang on, like grim death, in inverted commas, then you can precipitate a negative experience.
That's interesting. Anything else that you think we can learn from people who have NDEs?
Well, I think the after effects. I mean, my second book, which is reprinted as Resonant Mind, was all about what I call the ethic of interconnectedness. And we can learn from NDEs that the purpose, the underlying purpose of life is growth, and particularly growth in love and wisdom. And that's totally consistent with the Deunov philosophy that I was mentioning before.
I think most people would agree with that, but they don't act on it. I mean, I think of all the politicians who say, I'm a Christian, but don't behave in a Christian way.
Well, none of us is perfect.
Yeah, that's true.
We can have aims and values, and we don't always live up to them.
But there's a difference between being well-intentioned and being just hypocritical.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, La Rochefoucauld in the 17th century famously said that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue.
That's good. Let's talk about your books. As I understand, the most recent one was Survival? Body, Mind, and Death in the Light of Psychic Experience, 2017. Is that the most recent?
Well, both of those books were my early books, and so the original of Survival came out in 1984, and then so it was a reprint effectively with a new introduction. And the same for Resonant Mind, which was Whole in One. That came out in 1990. And so those are books that have long been out of print. And I didn't have time to do a thorough update of either of those books. And so I just, tried to make sure that they came out in a reasonable format.
So, what was Resonant Mind? What was the thesis of that?
Well, that was really on the subtitle of the original book was The Near-Death Experience and the Ethic of Interconnectedness. And I coined this term empathetic resonance to describe the capacity we have to enter into and feel what it's like to be someone else, not ourselves. And this happens cosmically in the mystical experience when you expand to your maximum capacity, as it were. And also, it happens in the deep life review, where instead of re-experiencing the event from your own viewpoint, you re-experiencing from every viewpoint, every angle that the event had. So it's like each event has many dimensions, but as many dimensions as there are people who experience it. And so it's experiencing what it's like to experience the whole event, not just your angle on it. And that really suggests the way I formulated it is that this metaphysics of interconnectedness and oneness and unity implies an ethic of interconnectedness, which is basically the golden rule, that we should treat other people as we want to be treated ourselves. In other words, we should behave with love and wisdom. And if you look at what Deunov said about this, he said that when we return to the invisible world, we will be examined on how we apply the law of love. That's the syllabus, and I think there's a lot in that.
Yes.
And if one knew that from an early stage, an early age, then one might live life in a particular way, or try.
Right. And then you had a new resonance. That was a group effort.
I've published a number of edited books, and I've also published compilations from my education project. And so those edited books, there are 4 of them. There was The Spirit of Science, based on mystics and scientists. Thinking Beyond the Brain, based on Beyond the Brain. Science, Consciousness and Ultimate Reality, based on a Templeton-funded project that we did of the same name. And then A New Renaissance, which explored this idea that we are in the process of a new renaissance with a return to spiritual sources.
Do you believe that? Because the world, it seems like it's going to hell in a handbasket, as they say. I mean, climate-wise, growing inequality, increasing autocrats.
Well, I think all of these things are happening, and so there's a process of globalization, of violence, of excess, of environmental damage. But at the same time, there are a lot of people working on renewable solutions. There are activist groups. I was just trying to think. There's a book that Blessed Unrest. That was the name of the title, which said that if you look at the large picture as reported in the media, then it's desperate. Whereas if you look and focus on what's happening with these thousands of NGOs all over the world, then there's a lot of hope. So there's grounds for despair and grounds for hope. But I feel ethically one has to come down on the we can do something about it side. But I'm there's also a sense of hope which is misused. Because when I was writing The Protein Crunch, I noticed that after a litany of despair, the final chapter of this ecological book, whether it's about rivers or population or the seas, and it always said, well, there is hope if we do X, Y, and Z. And I call this conditional hope. That there is hope if it's associated with positive action. But if we continue not doing these things and just hoping, then that doesn't produce any result.
No.
So paradoxically, we know what we need to do, but politically and economically, it's very difficult to do it.
What gives me hope is the recent strikes by high school students led by Greta Thunberg in Sweden that seems to be spreading to various countries. Are French students walking out of school to protest climate change as well?
I don't know. I hope they are.
Yeah.
Because it does make the point. Although I read an article today by somebody who his daughter missed a class to be in in this protest, and the very next day got on an aeroplane to go skiing. So that kind of says it all. But at least he was at the meeting.
As a footnote, could you say a word about the yellow vest protesters? They're angry about not having affordable wages or enough social supports, or what would they like to see specifically?
Well, it's a good question, because I think that's mutated, and where it started was a protest against the fuel tax, which Macron had said he was going to bring in as part of his green agenda. And I think the fundamental issue in France is the disconnect between the elite and the ordinary people, and the disconnect is particularly acute with Macron. Although, having said that, he has been getting out and around the country. He's been attending meetings, listening to people what they've had to discuss. They've got a big consultation is going on at the moment, and so everybody's being able to have their say, attend meetings, write in with suggestions, and so on. But I think I was listening to a program on France Culture this morning, which I listened to if I'm just going, I went to the market. And one of the speakers was saying, well, underlying all this is just the whole process of industrialization, of everything becoming larger, becoming larger scale, of people moving off the land into cities, of large-scale agriculture. And of course, we now know a recent report published just last week on the catastrophic decline of insects, which is almost entirely due to industrial agriculture, which we're using to try and feed more and more people. So we've got some quite systemic challenges. But I think what's happened with the Gilets jaunes is it's become a sort of generalized social protest and focus of discontent.
Yeah.
For ordinary people who feel that they're being left behind. And if you look at that across the countries, then a major factor is in fact the 2008 financial crisis, where very few, if any, bankers were sent to jail. They should have been, especially
only in Iceland.
Goldman Sachs was still running America. Many of those should be behind bars. And so people feel that they had to suffer 10 years of austerity because of some crisis that had nothing to do with them. And the same elite people are still running the system.
Do you notice any leaders standing out from the yellow vests? And how involved are young people? Or is it just kind of a grassroots popular
I think it's grassroots. I mean, they're trying not to have any spokespeople or leaders. And I mean, I also feel that there's a sense of solidarity about it, and people enjoy being together and collaborating and being part of something they think matters. So I think there's a sort of civility and congeniality about it as well, but it's been hugely disruptive at the same time. I mean, Marianne was stopped for half an hour at a roundabout, or it took her half an hour to get round a roundabout. They've closed motorways, they've tried to close borders, and the French are great people for direct action. I mean, vegetable growers are unhappy about supermarkets. They just turn up at the supermarket and dump a load of potatoes or turnips, right in the driveway of the supermarket. So there is a spirit of revolution in France, which is very strong, and much more so than in many other countries.
Mm-hmm. Could you say a word more about the protein crunch? What do you suggest as solutions that are practical?
Well, the fundamental thesis of the protein crunch is that as people move up, as they get better off, particularly the huge increase of middle class in China and India, which is taking people up off the poverty line at the same time. Then they want to eat more meat and more fish.
And drive more cars.
And indeed, I mean, so their impact on the planet is going to go up. But specifically in terms of food, one of my co-author, Jason Drew, has really put his ideas into practice, because he has this huge now multinational company called AgriProtein. And what AgriProtein is doing is producing animal feed for fly larvae and recycling waste, which is then delivered to the factories. And then waste is then consumed by the flies. And then the larvae are harvested and made into animal food.
Wow! By
so
waste,
that's very practical. That's a very practical step, and it's proving phenomenally successful in terms of the many millions of pounds that have been raised and the number of factories that are being created worldwide.
By waste, do you mean food garbage?
Yes. Yeah. And so there's a recycling aspect to it as well. So it's kind of virtuous circle. It doesn't smell very good, I must say. I went to one of the prototype places. You need a gas mask, I think, if you want to go into the factory itself.
So the garbage, like from restaurants and homes, is collected, fed to the flies, and then the protein of the fly larvae are turned into food for cattle and that kind of thing. Yeah,
that's exactly right. I mean, I don't know the fine detail, but that's the principle, which is a good one.
Absolutely. I know that Vedanta Shiva, or how you say her name in India, and other environmentalists who are concerned about food production say that we need to go to organic small farmers, because the big industrialists don't even feed that many people, and they hurt the soil, and the chemicals, as you say, hurt the insects, so that small-scale organic farming is got to happen.
I think that's generally true, and also it was the conclusion reached by, I think, about a 5-year-old report from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and so what the buzz phrase is sustainable intensification. You need to combine intensification with sustainability. I mean, one of the things that, if you start thinking about it, you realize that in the long run, we have to have a sustainable relationship with nature, or else we will get wiped out. And so there is an imperative there, and the sooner we realize that, the better. But we have to change our whole mentality, as being suggested by this commentator on France Culture, where if we continue with industrialization, mechanization, then the problems that are being created by that model will continue to intensify. And at a certain point, people are going to have to say, well, we really have to shift our course.
So where you live, do most people have gardens, vegetable gardens in their homes?
Yes, or allotments. There's
community gardens.
Yes, there's quite a lot of allotments where people go and grow their vegetables, but not in their own back garden.
Yeah.
We have we have a vegetable garden right behind the house. It's not big enough, but it's a start.
Yeah, I do, and I have 2 chickens, so they go around the yard and leave fertilizer and eat insects that aren't desirable and give me eggs. So it's a nice little ecosystem.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So I assume that you were interested in Prince Charles and wrote The Radical Prince because of his environmental interests.
Not just that.
Mm.
No, because what I realised was that his views, particularly on agriculture, medicine, and science, really came from a spiritual perspective, and so he's always talking about the sense of the sacred and the importance of a sense of the sacred and how we've lost that. And so the intent behind the book was to explain the philosophy and ideas that inform his work, and that's what I did. And so there are 2 versions of Radical Prince. There's a long one with lots of philosophy, which is 435 pages. That's the hardback. And then there's a 250-page version where the philosophy is summarized, and that things on. I don't go into things in quite the same detail. And so what I show, I think, is that the Prince has a coherent worldview, which is then expressed in his work. Mm-hmm. And recently, in November, he turned 70. And so I organised a conference to celebrate the event, and we had 200 people there at the Canterbury Cathedral.
Is there any hope that he'll be king, or will the Queen Elizabeth live forever?
Well, the Constitution is very clear that he will be king when she dies, and so there's no. A lot of people ask, well, won't it just skip a generation? And the answer is no, it won't. Other things being equal. But the Queen, I think, has a very good chance of making 100. And that means that Prince of Wales will be nearly 80. I mean, he'd be 78 when she's 100. So what's happening at the moment is that he's taking on more state affairs, and so that, for instance, he opens Parliament with her when it used to be done by Prince Philip. He's going to become the next head of the Commonwealth. He's taking on some of the patronages that she does. He's doing more tours in different parts of the world, which would have previously been done by her. And so there is a transition going on. But the great thing is that her longevity has enabled him to do some important work, and that's really his passion, is how he's able to help, and particularly his first charity that he founded was the Prince's Trust. I know tens of thousands of young people a year are still being helped by Prince's Trust programs.
Well, it sounds like you respect and like him.
Indeed, yes. And there was a very good documentary by the BBC marking his 70th birthday, where you really saw what he was actually like. Because he's a very amusing person. He's got a very sharp sense of humour. He's very good with people, and you really saw what he was like, and also what the Duchess of Cornwall was like. I mean, they laugh a lot together.
Oh, that's sweet. How would you define? We're kind of skipping to. How would you define consciousness? Because everyone is saying that's the ground of being. There's consciousness, and then there's mind. So, what is consciousness?
Well, again, it depends on the frame you're talking in, and the culture you're talking in. And and the term you're using, because consciousness as the ground of being is really being with a capital B, and that's a sort of the transcendent ground of of existence, which is one category. I think what's argued in the Galileo report, and there are different ways of expressing this, is that consciousness needs to be understood as fundamental in the same way as matter, whereas our current science regards matter as the only principle required in order to explain everything, including consciousness. And that's the real shift that we need. And there are two ways of making the shift. One would be, to go back, as it were, to a refined form of idealism. Another is, and some people are moving in this direction, panpsychism. And then another slightly different would be dual aspect monism or panentheism. And so the people are trying to find different ways forward, to present a coherent picture of the relationship between mind and brain and consciousness and matter.
So what's the dualist approach?
Well, the dualist approach is the Cartesian approach, which would say that these things are distinct and different. Philosophers have been arguing for 200 or 300 years about how incompatible principles can actually relate to each other. And the way that I see this is that in any world you can conceive of, you need consciousness and form. And it's matter that gives the form, but consciousness is the inside, as it were. The form is the outside. So you can't have an individual or a form of life or an expression of life unless there's both consciousness and the form in which that consciousness is expressed. So, for instance, in the spiritual world, this might be a body of light. Whereas in the physical world, it's not. It's a physical carbon-based body that we have. But that doesn't stop us actually having bodies in these other dimensions that we're not aware of.
So do you mean that we have layers of the aura, we could call it, or that we have, at the same time, we have a physical body, we have other dimensional forms, or just after death?
Yes, no, I think we probably do. But these are not generally apparent, and we're not generally aware of them. But if you look at the phenomenon of apparitions, then people can appear to others and be seen at a place where their physical body isn't. But the form that they appear in is so like the physical that is often mistaken for it. And I talk about this in a chapter of my book, Survival. I look at quite a number of case histories. And I also look at out-of-body experiences. And the very few, but very significant, I think, cases which are called reciprocal cases. And so a reciprocal case is where somebody experiences being out of the body and is seen by the person where they think they are as an apparition. In other words, that the two sides, in inverted commas, reinforce each other or are consistent.
Got it. And where do you find people to interview who've had NDEs or OBEs or that kind of thing?
Well, the way that we did it in the 80s, when this was all starting up, is that we would go on a radio program, write an article in a newspaper or a TV program, and at the end of the program, we'd invite people to write in if you had an experience like this. And so, IANS, Near-Death Experience Association, we got hundreds of letters. And then those were used as the basis for trying to understand the phenomenology of the near-death experience. And then at a later stage, it evolved so that Pim van Lommel, for instance, did a prospective study involving cardiac arrest. So he interviewed everybody from a number of hospitals who had a cardiac arrest. And then he was able to see more accurately what proportion of people remembered an NDE.
Do you remember what percent he found, remembered?
About 16%. And obviously those experiences had different depths. I mean, with all the studies fall within the 10 to 20% bracket of incidence.
And other people could have them but not remember?
I think that's very possible. Of course, again, there's no way of knowing, because obviously the coming back into the body, as it were, and then you might just blank out. In the same way as we don't remember our dreams, even though we know we've dreamt. If we can't even remember something the next morning. But what people always say is that the near-death experience is orders of magnitude more real than a dream. It's not a dream. It's a mistake to think it's just a dream.
Right. Some people turn to quantum mechanics to explain psi phenomena. Do you think that's a useful tool?
Yes, I think it's a useful tool because really, the general argument, and Dean Radin makes this argument, is that if quantum entanglement and non-locality is a phenomenon at the physical level, there might be a parallel at the macroscopic level, i.e. human level, a parallel explanation. One criticism of this is that it doesn't involve sending a signal. But then there's no signal in quantum entanglement. But at the same time, I think the signal metaphor is also wrong. It was the old one used 100 years ago, with the invention of radio, and a lot of experiments are set up so there's a sender and receiver. Oh, that's just a metaphor, because I think what's happening is that there's a sharing of experience at some kind of level, and so there's an overlap between the minds, which Rupert Sheldrake would call morphic resonance, and he's somebody else that you should definitely speak to.
I've tried.
Okay, and yeah, so I think it's also very useful in the sense that quantum mechanics and quantum entanglement is so well established scientifically that it does provide a thought structure that can be transferred from one area to another and make it more plausible.
Mm-hmm. What's your next book or research project? Where are you headed?
Well, I don't have a research agenda as such, like many people. I think, I've always got one, if not one or more projects on the go at any one time, and so I'm envisaging another phase to the Galileo Commission. I'm looking at doing an inspiring purpose on regenerating nature, having that as the theme. So I'm formulating those at the moment. And then the other thing I'm keen to do is to collate my book reviews onto a database so that they become available to people, and then possibly publish a series of volumes of book reviews in particular areas, because I review about 250 books a year at various levels of detail. But I've started categorizing my book reviews. I'm already up to 500, with only about a third of the journals covered so far.
And what do you do for fun in the midst of all this work?
Walk every day. Walk with my dog. Our dog every day. when I was in Scotland, I used to play golf once a week, and that's one of my sadnesses living in France is I only play golf 3 or 4 times a year now, and I try and play with my son because he's a very keen golfer if I'm in Scotland. So walking I think is probably the main thing. I listen to quite a bit of music. I'm very keen on Bach. I listen to Bach nearly every day, and I find it structures my consciousness in a very beautiful way, particularly the great preludes and fugues.
Yeah, I agree. Have we left anything out that people should know about what's happening today with psi research or organizations or whatever?
Well, I think the interesting question is the extent to which there is a real groundswell shift. Because on the one hand, the AI and mechanization of intelligence and the idea of technotopia is gaining ground. And on the other hand, there's an intensification of formulation of what Jennifer Gidley calls a human-centered future. So there's a technotopic future, and probably the future is going to be somewhere in between. But of course, the technotopic future is based on a mechanistic understanding of consciousness and the brain, which is very left hemisphere. And the reason I say that is that my friend Ian McGilchrist is the author of The Master and His Emissary, which is a magisterial book on left and right hemisphere thinking and its cultural implications. And we live in a left hemisphere society which values the outer, the material, the quantitative, the controllable, the bureaucratic, the legal, all of these areas. And we're starved inside. We're starved on the spiritual side. Although that, again, there's a huge resurgence of spirituality and mysticism. So it's all happening at the same time.
So it's interesting to see which synthesis will come out of this dialectical process.
Yes, well, maybe more than one. Because we tend to sort of look for a simple outcome, but the world is complex. And the outcomes are likely to be, and the processes are likely to be complex and intertwined. And I think, generally speaking, our thinking, particularly in economics and politics, is inadequate to the complexity of life and the importance of the long term. Because both economics and politics are geared to the short term, and that's not what we need, especially now. Mm-hmm.
Do you think the Brexit debate will be settled in a reasonable way, or will they just do a no-deal Brexit?
It's very difficult to say because we're moving towards the brink, and it doesn't look like either side is prepared to shift. I think what may happen, and I've just been looking at the Sunday Times today, is that the Prime Minister will lose the next vote. Then Parliament will assume control of the process. But what the outcome of that will be, I'm not quite sure. And I think everybody is fed up with all the arguments. It's very beautifully and amusingly satirized in the magazine Private Eye, where they had an item, for instance, 2 weeks ago, where the politicians were blaming the people for having voted in the way that they did and creating such a problem. So one has to laugh, really.
Well, what I don't understand is the issue that seems to be the most difficult is the hard border in Ireland. What does that mean? I don't understand that.
Well, it means that there'd be a customs declaration and customs. So everybody would have to stop when they get to the border. That's putting it sort of graphically. Like you have to, I mean, obviously a lot of these things can be done now electronically with tags, but it's particularly the Northern Irish representatives and the Ireland representatives, they simply can't agree on this. and so it's and the thing is that none of this was mentioned at all in the campaign. So it's proving one of the great sticking points, but nobody even mentioned it, which shows that the Irish question wasn't really being taken seriously. But again, it's coming up to the fore.
Well, if they don't settle on it, what does a no-deal Brexit do to the UK?
Well, it's a kind of crash out, and so I mean, in my case here, and I've got this on my desk now to do. I think the driving license, my UK driving license, will no longer be able to be used in France, and my tax status, we just don't know. We don't know what the relationship between the tax systems is. I mean, what has happened is the French Assembly has passed a law which guarantees the existing rights of expats in the country, and of course we're very valuable. We bring a lot of creative ideas. We spend a lot of money, and so we're we're contributing to French life and the French economy all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. This was very informative and interesting. I appreciate your time. I will get the transcript to you. And